Surviving Home is a documentary that essentially lets us know that the war on the overseas battlefield is just one war, and that oftentimes a lot of these veterans come home having to deal with a much bigger war, that being a continued life. So I think that the biggest thing that this documentary has going for it is just how incredibly eye-opening it all is. There's this assertion that the documentary makes that there is a disconnect between veterans and civilians. And while I obviously cannot speak for everyone, I do think that for a lot of us, we are pretty naive when it comes to really knowing and understanding what it is that these veterans have to go through when they come home. And so one of the things that I loved about this documentary is that they showcased some of the different possible fights that veterans from all different kinds of backgrounds could potentially face when they come home and attempt to reintegrate back into civilian life. So for example, we got to hear the story of a man named Claude who, because he had no other real opportunities, decided to volunteer for the Vietnam War. And when he came back, he ended up getting into drugs and alcohol as a way of coping with his external environment. Then there was Bobby, who had served during two wars, the Persian Gulf War and the Iraq War, and during one deployment in the Iraq War, his vehicle ended up getting blown up. Now, he was the only survivor, so besides having to deal with survivor's guilt, he also had to deal with the horrible reality of his wounds that consisted of course, burns all over his body, a head that had been burned right to the skull, a lost hand, and a lost left eyelid, as well as a bunch of the psychological problems that would come along with having to deal with all of that. Then there was Richard, who had served during World War II, and during this war, he had almost drowned. He should have been rightfully discharged, but he was not, and when he came home to nothing and with really nowhere to go. Then there was Tracy, who was serving as a closeted lesbian during the Iraq War during Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And when her sexual orientation became known amongst some of her comrades, they ended up taking advantage of her and raping her. So not only did she have to deal with that, but when she came home and actually began to work through all of that and found someone whom she loved, she then had to fight for her wife to be recognized in the same way that spouses in heterosexual relationships are recognized, so that she could receive the same benefits. And so one of the common themes that you will find within all of these stories in this documentary revolves around the theme of alienation. You have these people that go out and sacrifice their lives, their psychological health, and even their own humanity to keep us back at home safe. Then when they come home, there's this expectation on both sides that these veterans are able to just come back and go on with a normal life, when in reality, where a lot of the anxiety and PTSD and depression and rage and all of the other kinds of emotions that they could experience really stems from is in the fact that it's really not that easy. And besides that disconnect and subconscious or even conscious conflict between veterans and civilians, there is also this disconnect for veterans within their own selves when it comes to their own identities. For one, they have to deal with an identity change that makes them feel a sense of purposelessness. As a veteran or as someone a part of the war effort, they have this purpose of serving and protecting their country. But as a civilian, you have a lot of them, of course not saying all, but a good number of them that come back feeling broken and damaged. And so for them, it's kind of like, well, what is it that I'm now contributing to this world if not more strife and heartache, when they look at how it is that their chosen career path has then affected the people around them. And that's a tough thing to work through. Then there's also the fact that on the one hand, I know that these people take pride in being able to call themselves a veteran, but then on the other hand, it's that identity of being a veteran and all of the experiences that go into making them a veteran that really makes them hate themselves and their lives. And it really sucks to know that there really isn't a lot of help for these people when they come back home. But with all that being said, I love that this documentary also chose to make sure that they focused on the fight to bring back peace to these people's lives. For both the veterans and the filmmakers, it could have been really easy for them to just solely focus on their victimhood and nothing else. But what I love that these veterans realized, and also the filmmakers realized, is that that is not what life is about, right? Life is all about how you react to those things that challenge you the most. You can allow for those things to stop you, or you can allow for those things to really push you into being a better you. And for the people in this documentary, we got to see how some of them attempt to find solace in things like stand-up comedy or sports, or simply returning back to their childhood home, or just helping out other veterans that may be worse off than they are. And I loved seeing how these people are making strides every day, whether big or small, to really kind of get their life back on track. You know, it was all really inspiring, to say the least. And so what I lastly quickly wanted to touch on is the parallels between the foreign wars and the wars on our very own home front. Now, I know that this isn't what the documentary is about, but this was something that I had thought about while watching the documentary, and I felt like I would be remiss if I didn't at least talk about it in some way, shape, or form. So while watching the documentary, I couldn't help but to think about how there are people every day that are dealing with PTSD, anxiety, hypervigilance, and rage right here in our own society, and they didn't have to go overseas in order for that to happen. And this is something that I wanted to bring up because I really feel like this doesn't get talked about enough. You know, a lot of times I feel like people like to victim blame without really looking at and trying to understand the context behind these situations. And I just feel like if we can understand these stories from these veterans, then there's no reason as to why we can't understand and pay attention to our own brothers and sisters that are living in poverty, going through the exact same thing every single day. You know, at their core, these stories are no different. And of course, I understand that there are factors that go into why things are playing out in the way that they are, but I just feel like all around that more needs to be done in order to uplift these people. You know, if we can't necessarily fix all of the problems that come along with poverty, and if we can't necessarily fix the fact that wars are going to continue to happen, then where we need to really focus our attention on is how it is that we can really, like I said, uplift these people and help them really process these traumatic events that they unfortunately go through. And so, yeah, guys, I really enjoyed this documentary. If you or someone that you know has been a part of any war in some way, shape, or form, or even if you're not or you don't know anyone that has been a part of a war, then you should definitely still catch this documentary because a lot can be learned from this. You know, I myself can say that after watching this documentary, I do have a newfound respect for everyone that chooses to go into this career path, because that's a lot of sacrifice. And not only that, I have a newfound respect for all of the families that have someone out in the war effort, because that's a lot of sacrifice on their part as well. So yeah, if you can, make sure that you check out the documentary Surviving Home.